Hello again, Chris here to talk about another grad school reading. This one is about listening to images. This relates to the one I just had read recently about Gothenburg's Iron Well, publishing that as we speak to YouTube, but I'm going to read this right now. So, an exercise in counter intuition. So, this is Tina Compt. Oh, the person that was referenced to in the previous article. Page intentionally left blank. Here we go. That noise is going to come in handy. Take off these headphones because I don't need them. Not right now anyway. Helps to have my glasses on. Can't have both. It's not ideal. Anyway, can't have both, but I don't like it. Like any good introduction, this chapter might be best described as a throat-clearing gesture, the kind that introduces any inquiry with a series of queries and propositions that create an analytic space for thinking. My own space-making gesture ruminates on two central questions. How do we build a radical visual archive of the African diaspora that grapples with the recalcitrant and the disaffected, the unruly and the dispossessed? Through what modalities of perception, encounter, and engagement do we constitute it? These two questions induce a volley of corollary queries. What is the place in this archive for images assumed only to register forms of institutional accounting or state management? How do we contend with images intended not to figure Black subjects, but to delineate instead differential or degraded forms of personhood or subjection? Images produced with the purpose of tracking, cataloging, and constraining the movement of Blacks in and out of diaspora. What are their technologies of capture, and what are the stakes of the forms of accounting that engender these archives? These questions of archival practice have fueled my thinking for a number of years. In the pages that follow, they captivate my imagination in ways that return me to the same intellectual juncture at which I left off in the writings that directly precede it. I ended my last book, Images Matters, with a childhood memory of my father's quiet hum, the hum of a man mourning the loss of his wife. On the night of my mother's funeral, surrounded by his entire family and all of his friends in our home, my father hummed my mother's favorite Roberta Flack song. Swaying back and forth while his 11 and 13-year-old daughters sang over the record, he hummed instead of crying. A hum can signify a multitude of things. A hum can be mournful, it can be presence in absence, or can take the form of a gritty moan in the foreground or a soothing massage in the background. It can celebrate, animate, or accompany. It can also irritate, haunt, grate, or distract. On that indelible night in the basement of our home, my father hummed in the face of the unsayability of words. Excuse me. Even now, the memory of my father's quiet hum connects me to feelings of loss I cannot articulate in words, and it provokes in me a simultaneously overwhelming and unspeakable response. It is this exquisitely articulate modality of quiet, a sublimely expressive unsayability that exceeds both words as well as what we associate with sound and utterance, that moves me toward a deeper understanding of the sonic frequencies of that quotidian practices of Black communities. My aim in the chapters that follow is to animate the recalcitrant affects of quiet as an undervalued lower range of quotidian audibility. What is the relationship between quiet and quotidian? Each term references something assumed to go unspoken or unsaid, unremarked, unrecognized, or overlooked. They name practices that are pervasive and ever-present, yet occluded by their seeming absence or erasure in repetition, routine, or internalization. Yet the quotidian is not equivalent to passive everyday acts, and quiet is not an absence of articulation or utterance. Quiet is a modality that surrounds and infuses sound with impact and affect, which creates the possibility for it to register as meaningful. At the same time, the quotidian must be understood as a practice rather than action. It is a practice honed by the dispossessed in the struggle to create possibility within the constraints of everyday life. For Blacks in diaspora, both quiet and the quotidian are mobilized as everyday practices of refusal. The relationship between quiet, the quotidian, and the everyday practices of refusal, enacted and inherited by dispossessed subjects, is the defining tension of this book and the archives of images it explores. It focuses on a genre of image that is both quiet and quotidian, identification photography. These photos are produced predominantly for the regulatory needs of the state or the classificatory imperatives of colonialization. Although some are repurposed by the recipients as well as by artists and relations as objects of personal recollection, collective or community memory, commemoration or attachment, identification photos are not produced at the desire of their sitters. They are images required of or imposed upon them by empire, science, or the state. The unexceptional format of identification photos and the routinized nature of bureaucratic images frequently lead to a failure to read or a blanket dismissal of them altogether, as we are tempted to see only their success in capturing muted governmentalized subjects of the state. Rather than reducing identification photos to the instrumental functions for which they were created, listening to images engages these images as conduits of an unlikely interplay between the vernacular and the state. Taking a counterintuitive approach to understanding quiet as well as the quotidian, it theorizes the forms of subjectivity enacted through the vernacular practice of identification photography. I consider the quotidian dimensions of these imaging practices not in the traditional sense of a site of social reproduction. I engage them instead as instances of rupture and refusal. At the heart of this book is a proposition that is also an intervention, one for which listening to images is at once a description and a method. It designates a method of recalibrating vernacular photographs as quiet, quotidian practices that give us access to the affective registers through which these images enunciate alternate accounts of their subjects. It is a method that opens up the radical interpretive possibilities of images and state archives we are most often inclined to overlook. By engaging the paradoxical capacity of identity photos to rupture the sovereign gaze of the regimes that created them by refusing the very terms of photographic subjection they were engineered to produce. Throughout the book, my arguments emerge from what I consider the endlessly generative space of the counterintuitive, the foundational counterintuition that serves as my first point of departure is a contention that, contrary to what might seem common sense, quiet must not be conflated with silence. Quiet registers sonically, as a level of intensity that requires focused attention. Analogously, quiet photography names a heuristic for attending to the lower range of intensities generated by images assumed to be mute. Redirecting Ariella Azoulay's evocative proposal to watch rather than look at photographs, 2008, page 16, the choice to listen to rather than simply look at images is a conscious decision to challenge the equation of vision with knowledge by engaging photography through a sensory register that is critical to Black Atlantic cultural formations: sound. In his foundational writings developing the conceptual framework of the Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy defines sound and music in particular as a crucial modality of what he calls a politics of transfiguration. His musical transliteration of a sonic politics of transfiguration invites us to attend to the lower frequency through which these transfigurations are made audible and accessible. Page 37. Taking inspiration from Gilroy, it is through sound that I seek a deeper engagement with the forgotten histories and suppressed forms of diasporic memory that these images transmit. I theorize sound as an inherently embodied process that registers at multiple levels of the human sensorium. To invoke another counterintuition that serves as a second point of theoretical departure, while it may seem an inherent contradiction in terms, sound need not be heard to be perceived. Sound need not be heard to be perceived. Sound can be listened to, and in equally powerful ways, sound can be felt. It both touches and moves people. In this way, sound must therefore be theorized and understood as a profoundly haptic like feely, form of sensory contact. My arguments in the chapters that follow extend the range and scope of our understanding of sound by returning to the fundamental definition of what constitutes sound and sonic perception, starting deliberately and specifically with the lowest sonic frequencies of all. Frequency. In acoustics, the number of complete vibrations or cycles occurring per unit of time in a vibrating system, such as a column of air. Frequency is the primary determinant of the listener's perception of pitch. Audible frequency. A periodic vibration whose frequency is audible to the average human. The generally accepted standard range of audible frequencies is 20 to 20,000 hertz. Frequencies below 20 hertz are generally felt rather than heard, assuming the amplitude of the vibration is great enough. Wikipedia.com. I'm going to pause it here. Get a sip of apple juice. Going to make every second count. In his celebrated 2003 monograph, In the Break, Fred Moten asks, what is the sound that precedes the image? Departing from Moten, my invitation, not just to look, but to listen as well as to quiet photos, requires us to embrace a different understanding of sound. A scientific definition of sound is frequency. To a physicist, audiologist, or musicologist, sound consists of more than what we hear. It is constituted primarily by vibration, and contact is defined as a wave resulting from the back and forth vibrations of particles in the medium for which it travels. The lower frequencies of these images register as what I describe as felt sound, sound that, like a hum, resonates in and as vibration. Audiologists refer to such frequencies as infrasound, ultra-low frequencies emitted by or audible only to certain animals, such as elephants, rhinoceroses, and whales. While the ear is the primary organ for perceiving sound, at lower frequencies, infrasound is often only felt in the form of vibrations through contact with parts of the body. Yet all sound consists of more than what we hear. It is an inherently embodied modality constituted by vibration and contact. Listening to images explores the lower frequencies of transfiguration enacted at the level of the quotidian, in the everyday traffic of Black folks with objects that are both mundane and special. Photographs. I've read this word way too many times without actually shamefully knowing what it is. Okay, so they kind of just say what it is right there. Quotidian meaning every day. In the everyday life. Okay, sorry, driving me nuts. What are the lower frequencies of these quotidian practices, and how do we engage their transfigurative potential? As a vernacular practice mobilized by Black people in the diaspora, photography is an everyday strategy of affirmation and a confrontational practice of visibility. Vernacular photographs are banal as well as singular. They articulate both of the ordinary and the exceptional texture of Black life. My approach to these images, archives, and the image-making practices that produced them revalues the quotidian as a site of cultural formation that Georges Perec designates as, infraordinary. Everyday practices we don't always notice, and whose seeming insignificance requires excessive attention. Attending to the infraordinary and the quotidian reveals why the trivial, the mundane, or the banal are in fact essential to the lives of the dispossessed and the possibility of Black futurity. This book proposes a haptic mode of engaging the sonic frequencies of photographs. It offers an alternate take on watching photos that materializes their transfigurations, albeit not in the form of statements of fact or as narratives of transit or mobility. They are accessible instead at the haptic frequency of vibration, like the vibrato of a hum felt more in the throat than in the ear. Each chapter explores a selection of photos that I define as quiet to the extent that before they are analyzed, they must be attended to by way of the unspoken relations that structure them. I do so by setting them in a kind of sensorial relief that juxtaposes the sonic, haptic, historical, and affective backgrounds and foregrounds through and against which we view photographs. As we will see, It is an archival interrogation of the multiple temporalities of visual archives grounded in a Black feminist mode of analysis that is profoundly grammatical in nature. Listening to Images theorizes the anterior sensibilities of a series of photographic archives of the African diaspora by unpacking the forms of photographic accounting and capture that these images enact, and how these forms of capture and accounting affect their viewers. Engaging these images as decidedly haptic objects is a method that requires us to interrogate both the archival encounter as well as the content of archival collections in multiple tenses and multiple temporalities, and in ways that attend to both their stakes and possibilities. It is a method that reckons with the fissures, gaps, and interstices. I'm gonna Google this for pronunciation purposes. Interstices I guess that's how you'd say it, interstices, that emerge when we refuse to accept the truth of images and archives. The state seeks to proffer through its production of subjects posed to produce particular types of regulated and regulatable subjects. The disordering and disruptive archival practice enacted in these pages thus uses sound and frequency to question the grammar of the camera as both an event of photography and a photographed event, as well as the haptic temporalities of photographic capture as pernicious instruments of knowledge production. As a series of 4 length essays, each of the chapters that follow stages an encounter with an archive of identification photos of Blacks in diaspora that enacts a practice of listening to quiet photography. Here again, listening to images is constituted as a practice of looking beyond what we see and attuning our senses to the other affective frequencies through which photographs register. It is a haptic encounter that foregrounds the frequencies of images and how they move, touch, and connect us to the event of the photo. Such a connection may begin as a practice of careful looking, but it does not end there. Focusing on the forms of refusal visualized through these images, the book rethinks foundational approaches to diaspora studies that emphasize mobility, resistance, and expressiveness. It uses the conceptual frameworks of quiet, stasis, and refusal to reclaim the Black quotidian as a signature idiom of diasporic culture and Black futurity. Chapter 1, Quiet Soundings, The Grammar of Black Futurity, examines an archive of identification photographs in Blacks in diaspora that complicates simple depictions of diasporic movement, settlement, and emplacement, passport photos. It explores the frequency of a collection of found passport photos of Black British men in post-war Birmingham in the United Kingdom by juxtaposing the images with 2 dissonant but related archives of vernacular photographs. The subjects staged in these images are presumed to capture mute supplicants of governmentality. Listening attentively to these quiet photos gives us access to the registers of fugitivity they simultaneously animate and suspend, as well as the creative strategies of refusal they at once reveal and conceal. Building on these counterintuitive suppositions, Chapter 2, Striking Poses and Intense Grammar, Stasis and the Frequency of Black Refusal, proceeds from a third counterintuitive contention. Stasis is neither an absence nor a cessation of motion. It is a continual balancing of multiple forces in equilibrium. The chapter theorizes stasis as a temporal modality of diasporic motion held in suspension in ways that hover between stillness and movement. It juxtaposes 2 additional archives of vernacular photography of Blacks in diaspora, late 19th century ethnographic photos of rural Africans in the Eastern Cape, and early 20th century studio portraits of African Christians in South African urban centers. Focusing on the sonic frequency and creative reappropriation of these portraits by the South African photographer Santu Mofokeng in his acclaimed work, The Black Photo Album / Look at Me, 1890-1950, the essay explores the continuities and disruptions between vernacular portraiture and compulsory photography. Viewed together, these images blur the line between postured performances and compelled poses, and in the process, they redefine what it means to strike a pose. Chapter 3, Haptic Temporalities, The Quiet Frequency of Touch, stages an embodied encounter with an archive of quiet photography intended to regulate and literally arrest the movement of a class of individuals deemed criminal by the state, convict photos. The chapter juxtaposes two archives of incarcerated Black subjects, convict photographs taken between 1893 and 1904 of inmates at Breakwater Prison in Cape Town, South Africa, and mid-20th century mugshots of African-American freedom riders in the US South. It uses these images to explore the possibilities of what we apprehend and what we apprehend differently when we engage criminal identification photos through their physical, affective, and archival touches. The through line that connects each of the chapters is a critique of the limits of contemporary discourses of resistance and a rigorous engagement with the discourse of fugitivity in African diaspora studies and Black feminist theory. I theorize the practice of refusal as an extension of the range of creative responses Black communities have marshaled in the face of radicalized dispossession. In this context, refusal is not a response to a state of exception or extreme violence. I theorize it instead as practices honed in response to sustained everyday encounters with exigency and duress that rupture a predictable trajectory or flight. Toward this end, the final chapter of the book is written as a coda that grapples with the grammar of Black futurity as it confronts us in the contemporary moment. It assesses the frequency of a very different set of criminal identification, photos, and their reappropriation by urban African-American youth struggling to develop their own practices of refusing the statistical probability of premature Black death in the 21st century. Listening to Images reclaims the photographic archive of precarious and dispossessed Black subjects in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries by attending to the quiet but resonant frequencies of images that have been historically dismissed and disregarded. Refocusing our attention on their sonic and haptic frequencies and on the grammar of Black fugitivity and refusal that they enact reveals the expressiveness of quiet, the generative dimensions of stasis, and the quotidian reclamations of interiority, dignity, and refusal marshaled by Black subjects in their persistent striving for futurity. Another page intentionally left blank. So, very powerful stuff. I know I just kind of read through it very quickly, but I do plan on doing a little bit of reflection upon this piece, especially when they're talking about looking beyond. Like, I like what they said here about how there are some sounds that are still sounds, but they're not, but the difference is audible. Like, can you hear them? Because some sounds you can't hear, but you can feel. So some images, seems like what they're saying here is that some images you don't just see, you can feel. And that relates to what we did, not in week 8 last week, as we went to the Contemporary Art Center, but the week before that, we were talking about, what was I just about to say? Studium and punctum, like studium. See if I can find it here. Studium. Centralized resource for studying everything campus has to offer. Oh, it's an app. It's a Latin word meaning study, zeal, dedication. They refer to this, studium, and punctum. Studium describes the elements of an image rather than the sum of the image's information and meaning. The punctum contains deeper dimension. The elements of punctum penetrate the studium. They have the ability to move the viewer in a deep and emotional way. So it seems like studium, in this sense, is referring to the surface level stuff. See if an image will help at all. Roland Barthes, I think that is, he's the person who came up with it. Studium indicates historical, social, or cultural meanings extracted via semiotic analysis. Photograph taken by this person in 1979, a war-torn street in Nicaragua with 3 armed soldiers patrolling the street and 2 nuns crossing the section, could be interpreted as a presence of the traditional oppositions between war and religion, violence and spirituality. Okay, traditional oppositions between war and religion. Just saying, I'm just saying that's a bold claim someone's making. Traditional oppositions, like, not in my mind, you know, like it's kind of an excuse to be. Anyway, the punctum points to those features of a photograph that seem to produce or convey a meaning without invoking recognizable symbolic system. So you see the soldiers, so semiotic analysis, you look at symbols to see what their meaning is. So like viva is a Spanish word that means live, to live, like vivir, to live. These nuns, these soldiers, we see the soldiers, we know they're soldiers because you're carrying weapons, they have helmets and uniforms, But the nuns, we know they're nuns because we're going off of symbols in order to tell us this is what it is. But this kind of meaning is unique to the response of the individual viewer of the image. The punctum punctuates the studium and as a result pierces the viewer. To allow the punctum effect, the viewer must repudiate all knowledge. Bars insists that the punctum is not simply the sum of desires projected. Instead, it arises from details that are unintended or uncontrolled. Photography can be distinguished from painting or drawing in that its apparatus visualizes the world automatically rather than being wholly informed by the interventions of the photographer. Speaks to the indexical nature of the medium that accounts for the importance of emotion and subjectivity. Randomly Lick's most famous, second part of the book. Excuse me. So I think that is kind of a helpful distinction here between sort of the images we see and we just think it's just an image, like it's just a picture, but there's always more to it than it's not just a picture. And I think the punctum really speaks to the whole nature of like how an image affects the viewer individually, you know, not just what is there on the surface level, that sort of stuff. But I got to make sure I put this DOI in the description of the YouTube video. But it looks like this book, this is just the introduction. This book is Listening to Images, Duke University Press, 2017. So I will try to find a citation and or DOI for the YouTube video. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you all for watching, being here, listening. Kind of ironic that I'm doing a thing talking about listening and I'm referring to you, the listeners. If there are going to be any listeners, I hope there are, maybe not. If not, no big deal. It kind of reminds me of what I was just reading of just because I say it doesn't mean that no one listens to it, I guess, sort of. Anyway, have a lovely day. Hope you have a good one. And I look forward to the next recording, whenever it may be.